Hi, and welcome to another episode of Weekly Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm your host, Bridget Burns with the University Innovation Alliance.
And I'm Sara Custer, the Editor-in-Chief at Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, we bring you an interview or a conversation with a leader in the field that we think you should be listening to and we think has an important voice. In particular, we bring it to you on a Monday and make sure it's as uplifting as possible. That's why we call it Start the Week with Wisdom. We're trying to distill their wisdom, their perspective, and what we can learn from each other along the way. So that is why we have invited you here today. This show, Weekly Wisdom, just so you know, is sponsored both by Carnegie Corporation of New York, but also by Mainstay, which is a student engagement platform that is used by an array of institutions around the country. The thing that really I like about Mainstay is that they engage in external research that is conducted by faculty in the field who are doing peer-reviewed research to make sure that their product actually works. They published a lot of results. You can go to mainstay.com to hear more. The thing that stands out that a lot of folks have heard about is that they were able to reduce the summer melt at Georgia State by 21%, and they were able to help them retain 1,200 additional students in a separate study. So again, check out mainstay.com for more information. But today, we're super excited to now transition to our guest. I'll bring up. Today's guest is Jacob Fraire, president of ECMC Foundation. Jacob, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be with you.
And it's also our first day where we're having Sara on board. So Sara, welcome to the internet. And
thanks for having me.
It's a perfect opportunity, both the shift in kind of changing of guards with Inside Higher Ed, but also ECMC going off on this new exciting journey under your leadership. And we're really excited to share the exciting developments that you're leading there for our audience, who I think are going to be very, very happy to hear about it. So first, Jacob, can you just share with us a little bit about your background and kind of what brought you here to this role?
Certainly, Bridget, I'm happy to do so. And Sara, I look forward to the conversation and certainly hoping that you'll give me a little bit of allowance with some softer questions, maybe not some hard-edged questions, but we'll dive in, Bridget, to your question. I think for me, the journey began, actually, I'm in Los Angeles, California as we speak, and it really began in the central elements of California. As a child, I was a member of a migrant family. We migrated from West Texas through California all the way to Washington State in search of seasonal migrant farm work. So when I say that I work in the field, I literally worked in the fields. And that grounding of 9 years of interrupted education, where we were moving from labor camp to labor camp to labor camp, from elementary school to elementary school to elementary school, really gave me a deep sense of empathy for the trajectory of education for individuals across our great union and across the world, frankly. And so for me, that grounded me in thinking of what is it that we need to do individually and as community to make sure that we really facilitate that uninterrupted education for all of our students. And so even as I went on to college and then later moved myself to Washington, D.C., it really was grounded in that field work of having to move from school to school, and in some cases, even spent only 1 or 2 weeks in school before we moved on from there. I have been privileged, and I'll be very frank, this is 80% luck and 20% design. I've been privileged to be in positions over the last 30 years of really being a conduit in a public policy space to make sure that we are cognizant of the kinds of policies, state and federal policies, that are conducive for students to be successful, and particularly low-income students. And so when the call came a 1.5 years ago to possibly join ECMC Foundation in this stage of their development, it was kind of a quick yes, because it was important for us to think about how do we serve the 330 million Americans and the 16 or so million students who are in undergraduate education. And so for us, for my wife and I, as we thought about this assignment, this journey, it became an important yes, but it became sort of an easy yes, because ECMC Foundation, working alongside the academy, working alongside higher education, really we have some important work ahead. And so it's a privilege for me to be here.
Great.
That's an incredible story, Jacob. You must be quite unique in this field, but certainly probably in many other sectors of having such an influential background that has led you to where you are, to leading the ECMC Foundation. I wonder if there is like a specific observation in leadership that comes to mind whenever you think about your own style, and if it was sometimes we learn from what not to do from leaders just as much as we learn what to do. Are there any examples that come to mind for you of leadership styles that you've learned from observing, either good examples or bad examples?
Certainly. I'll focus on the good, Sara, if you're comfortable with the good. I think that I learned early on that there are many individuals who come into our lives. Some provide implicit mentorship, implicit role models, and others you almost have to call out and be much more explicit about the relationship that you have with those individuals. But leaders are cognizant at all times that we have a responsibility to help and grow and develop our peers, and certainly the team who is working alongside with us. We have that inherent responsibility. As I said earlier, part of my trajectory was 80% luck, but a part of that fortune was having people along my journey in terms of the decisions that we make. When I was in high school, the only outlook that I had coming out of poverty was the United States military. And I had a mentor who was a retired Marine Corps captain who said to me, Jacob, absolutely, you would be a fantastic officer in the United States military, but first you need to go to college, like get your grounding in post-secondary education, and then you can certainly pursue a career in the military. And I think that was such sage advice and guidance that I received, because certainly we all know this in this field and in the academy, we absolutely know this, that there's great value to society with an educated populace. So I think my leadership take is, over the years, be intentional about who you're mentoring and that you mentor individuals in your space.
And I think that's a great observation. And also just thinking about how many people you're influencing that you're unaware of at any given moment in time through modeling your leadership. So I agree that your background is just incredible, and it's and the power of that story is going to go so much further than you'll ever know, right? There's so many young people who are going to hear your story and see the example that you're leading of what's possible. And it's just kind of mind blowing to think about the number of lives who you'll be able to inspire. But I'm curious about if you really thought I'm just curious about what's the most surprising element of your career, because you have this really respected and expansive career in policy, which is the perfect, I think, background to bring to leading ECMC at this moment in time, given just the robust challenge ahead, and that we can't just nibble around doing little tiny things. We have to think more substantively. But I'm just wondering did you see yourself here? Like, what's been the most interesting or unexpected aspect of your journey?
I think perhaps if I could do a retrospect of my career, Bridget, Sara, it's that while I have worked in the public policy domain and alongside higher education, I used to represent universities in Washington, D.C. As an example, I used to represent community colleges in the state capital of Texas, all 50 community colleges, and yet I have not worked for an academic institution. So I have not spent considerable time working at a college, whether it's a 2-year institution or a 4-year institution, as a way of perhaps introducing one of my mentors. It's my wife, Virginia, who has served in community college her entire career and did a 4-year stint at the University of Texas at El Paso. So in some ways, I kind of compare my career trajectory with someone who really does spend time and effort in the field. So much of the real work happens at colleges and universities across our great nation. And those of us who are in a position of privilege, whether it's in the policy space or in the philanthropy space, we really are partners, supporting from the side, supporting from behind. But the good work happens at colleges. That's where faculty members, that's where administrators, that's where practitioners work with individuals who really are looking for that day-to-day, not just teaching and learning, but that aspiration with them so they can get across the finish line. I think that if I were to say to you that I was expecting to be at ECMC Foundation 20 years ago when I was still in Washington, D.C., that would not be accurate. There was a time when I thought I would finish my entire career at the federal level. But I think along the lines, we grow as individuals, and I understood very quickly that there is so much important work that happens locally. And by locally, I mean talk about states and counties that is critical to students that frankly, from sort of the federal level, we aren't able to see, let alone touch. Tremendous resources that are available through the federal government, through the federal apparatuses, unequivocally. But serving students locally at the state level or at the county level or at the community college level, that's the kind of work that we're trying to do now with the national landscape, right? So ECMC Foundation serves the entire union, but we're cognizant that the real work happens locally, and we have to be respectful of that.
That's great. And I love that the idea that your wife being on a campus probably gives you all kinds of perspective that you wouldn't get, because you do kind of have to choose. Like, you can either stay at the altitude level that is much higher and making the observations and inferences that you're able to do from the policy, from the foundation lens, but you don't also get to have that empathy on the ground. And so the fact that you have that kind of connection's got to be incredibly valuable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would also say, I mean, even though I think you may have sold yourself a bit short there, Jacob, when you were saying that you've never worked at an institution, so you maybe aren't on the coalface of everything. And while I totally agree with you that it is the people at institutions working day to day that really understand this and really are doing this work, I think the stuff that you people in your role have been doing at a community college level, a four-year level, at the federal policy level is equally as important. And with that, I guess, panopticon perspective that you have, I'm curious to know what you think needs to change right now in higher education. If you could make one change, what would that be?
So I think if you allow me, I'd like to maybe think about historically the role of higher education and how have we constructed higher education. So we have great case history in the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, where we have really, as a nation, valued and coveted higher education. I mean, higher education spans almost the length of our union's livelihood. In the case of a couple of institutions that actually even preceded the independence of our nation. And for the longest time, we have valued that the academy has the prerogative to determine who we teach, what we teach, and how we teach. I think that's sort of those tenets have been longstanding. To answer your question, I'm thinking that for us in this point in the trajectory of higher education and where we are with today's students, I think we need to re-examine those last two tenets of how we teach and what we teach. It's clear to me that demography in some ways has forged the academy to really teach today's learners. We don't have a choice but to teach today's learners, right? The demography caught up to us. If you think of the construct of Hispanic serving institutions or even minority serving institutions, those came through federal designation, but those came after our colleges realized that people of color, non-traditional students, were now coming to their colleges. But we have work to do with regards to changing the framing of how we teach. And by how we teach, I'm talking about the modalities of teaching, right? We know through the research that individuals have different ways of learning and optimizing their learning individuals. We know through our colleagues in K-12 that work with special needs students, with disability students, that there is value in individualized learning plans for students. And yet in the academy, we still haven't yet reframe the different teaching pedagogies for different learners. And I think we can do some work in that space, not across all elements, but certainly to make sure that we meet our students. I'll call out as an example, Sara, and I'm giving you a long-winded response. At ECMC Foundation, we are funding a heavy emphasis on work on men of color. men of color. So we know through the research that men of color tend to lag with regards to college enrollment and certainly college completion relative to their counterparties in terms of men who are white males, to be exact, and then even to some extent to the female counterparties. Some of that research that we're conducting now really looks at what's the relationship between men of color who are attending post-secondary education and what they are learning in higher education and the sequence of their learning trajectory, right? So there's a great conversation that we're taking place right now about making sure that the content that is being taught is relevant to the workplace and what those skills demand will be when they get employed. Absolutely. But I think there's another conversation about how do we sequence even the core learning so that we're learning the fundamentals of the education, even as we're also teaching the young man what's relevant to them. And I think that's an important reform, or at least an area we need to reconsider. I think that there's some early indications among some of the colleges about re-examining the length in which we teach a traditional academic term, right? So who's to say the 16 weeks is this magical empirical time frame for us to be able to teach a traditional course? There are some colleges that are now experimenting with whether it's an 8-week term or a 10-week term that really allows us to be able to accelerate the learning sequence for students, and that allows students to continue to work, because most of our students, particularly in community colleges, and I would argue in some non-selective regional universities, most of the students work, and they work part-time or they work full-time. So I think we can have an opportunity to re-examine how much time do we want them to actually have in class before they earn those first important credits.
That's great. And I think there are resulting policy changes to happen. Well, mainly, I guess, call it policy, internal, like how you get tenure needs to probably have a relationship with teaching. just a relationship, maybe. Don't want to be too radical. We're going to probably need to incentivize and reward some of those more dynamic and innovative, teaching styles, pedagogy, modalities, all of that. There are, but there's also like enough evidence we already know that this works. Like it's really about scale, right? So it's definitely going to be an important element if we're going to be able to achieve the goal that you put forward, which for folks is pretty ambitious around closing equity gaps, which obviously the one place that all students go is the classroom. So I think it's great that you're focusing your efforts there.
And it sounded, sorry, Bridget, if I could just come in. It's also sounded like you were saying, Jacob, that you kind of want institutions to act on their own before they're kind of told to act, if I understood that correctly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Reform has to happen in the field, right? So those of us who are in a position of seeding ideas, seeding innovations, seeding the kinds of reforms, that's our only responsibility, is to be able to provide enough proof point there so that there is an evidence that allows us to say, yes, there are outcomes that can be achievable. But Sara, to your question, the academy, the field has to be the one that leads to reform. Mm-hmm. It has to be the ones that lead to reforms. And then you have system leaders, higher education leaders who are then courageous enough to go all the way to the edge and say, yes, of course, now we're ready for these reforms to be institutionalized across systems. I'll give you one example, and it's a super concrete example. Certainly, we are all familiar with the research on developmental education and yesteryear's multi-term trajectory of students to go from non-college ready to the very first credit-bearing course. Sometimes we would ask students to go to 1 or 2 or even 3 semesters consecutively before they got to that. There was extensive reform that took place in the state of Tennessee on co-requisite instruction as an important reform for developmental education. It took several years to prove that was effective. And then when it made its way to, for example, Texas, where I spent some time representing community colleges, by the time it came to Texas as an option for reform, it took a lot of important conversations with faculty, with academic leaders, with my community colleges but we got to yes. And we got to yes because the data told us that for those students, co-requisite instruction was an important accelerator to get them to that very first important class.
Great.
Fascinating.
Well, this has been super insightful. I also want to turn back to you, not put the hot seat, but it's a positive hot seat. I'm curious, beyond now that we have a sense of kind of what brought you here and for you, the things that you think need to change, but I'm also wanting to look a little back about your career. And you've done, you've given us a taste of kind of where you've been and the types of roles you've been able to play. I'm just curious if there's one thing that you are most proudest of from your career that as you look back is like the one thing that for you is like if you had to pick one.
So Bridget, you're going to get me in trouble with that question because the minute that you don't mention others, then I'm going to get a lot of phone calls. But I would say my work, my opportunity to serve the 50 community colleges in the great state of Texas and the 700,000 students whom they serve, just on the credit bearing side of the higher education, has been a great privilege. We did good work in Texas together. To the person, the community college presidents who drove the agenda, who drove the discussion, were solid leaders who were focused on their students, and it was such a privilege to work alongside them. Texas in 2023 redesigned its funding formula for community colleges. That funding formula was established in 1972. Well, 1972, I was 7 years old. So it took us 50 years to not just build the data that would prove the evidence, but really have the kinds of courageous conversations to fundamentally change how one state, not an unimportant state, funds 50 community colleges. And so a bill was passed in 2023. We now have a new model. It is an experiment. And so I'm hopeful that we redesign it in an important way. I'm going to give you one example of one of the reforms in that bill. And this is why, to your question, I'm proud of that work. We had been funding community colleges agnostic of the type of student who was coming to us, right? So whether it was my children, and I do have a son who's going to Austin Community College, or whether it was a child of a recently arrived immigrant, their enrollment at community colleges was treated exactly the same. Under this new formula, colleges now get funded indexed by low-income students, adult students, and students who are not college ready. And I think that's an important elevation to how we need to rethink about how we fund our respective institutions across the union, but certainly in the state of Texas as a good example.
I think those are great examples.
Yeah, that sounds like wonderful work. Do we have time for one more question, Bridget? Or
no, I think we want to land the plane with these final ones. So we have the kind of the rapid fire questions to round it out. The first is the advice that the best advice that you've received in your career that has helped you. Who gave it to you, and what was it that like has struck you the most?
So my very first boss out of college, a person who you'll see not in the headlines, but whose name is very much embedded in the footprints of several of the amendments to the Higher Education Act of 1965. Her name was Marilyn Lee McAdam. So if you look at the archives of higher education policy development in Washington, you'll see her name in the margins. Marilyn shared with me much earlier in my career, Jacob, be careful not to believe your own press releases. Right? So it's important for us to recognize the work that we're doing, but not to be so centered on our own achievements, on our own propositions of what we're doing, that we lose sight of what's really important out in the field. So I realize that Sara is here with us, and so Sara, it's not that we don't believe in press releases, but what Marilyn taught me is don't get caught up in your own press releases. Do the work out there, irrespective of the kind of attention that you might get.
Good. Very good advice, especially for some of the egos that exist out there. Jacob, what's the advice that you consistently give to others who are aspiring to leadership levels?
I maybe to a fault, Sarah, I'm an optimist. And if you know my background, and if you know my background, you would say, well, that's just impossible. How can you possibly be optimistic when you've seen almost the worst of what a person can ordeal? And we lived in labor camps that would make a grown person cry, right? We lived in labor camps where it would be unsafe, and yet we lived there for weeks or months at a time. And yet my optimism drives the work. And what I share with people who come into my office, who walk into my office, who I have the privilege to have coffee conversation, is we have to be optimistic, because the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands of students who are dependent on our work, it starts with us being optimistic, not just about their potential, because their potential is unequivocal, but we have to be optimistic that our systems will be there to serve them. And that drives my work. And that's what I would advise anyone who's thinking about doing important work in this field.
That's great. And I think your story is such a testament. It's like the ultimate example of the American dream, right? And so it makes sense that your work is about ensuring everyone can achieve that, right? Anyone can achieve their full potential regardless of their background, and like such a great example. And yeah, to know your story is to be optimistic. It's such a great example. So the last question is there a leadership book that has been most useful in your journey? Our audience often will message us that this becomes their catalog of books that they use. So it's their kind of professional development resource list. So if there's anything, whether it's about managing or leading, is there one that you you use most often when you refer it to others?
I do not, Bridget. I'm so sorry I am so sorry to disappoint, and hopefully our viewers will understand. I will say that I gravitate towards the writings of George Will. I gravitate toward the writings of Tom Friedman. I think those two individuals are global thinkers. I think those two individuals remind us that there is a world beyond our circles, beyond our four walls. I think those two individuals remind us that there's a middle in our conversations, that there is opportunity for the discourse to live and thrive in the middle, so that we might moderate our current contemporary thinking of the two sides of the spectrum being the only sides that are taking place. So no book specifically, Bridget, but certainly I would always encourage anyone to sit down and read one of the pieces that George Will has to say, and then the same thing with Tom Friedman. I love the global thinking. It's important for us to remember that we, as the United States of America, do not live in a vacuum.
That's great. Those are wonderful final words. I love your mantra, be optimistic. So that be optimistic, and also be aware that we are not in a bubble, so or in a vacuum. So thank you so much for spending this time today and for sharing your wisdom with us. Sara, it's wonderful to welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Well, I loved it. And for those of you at home, I hope this has been inspiring and hopeful for you on a Monday, and we will see you next time.
See you next time.